Thank you everyone for being here. It's really my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lan Li, Assistant Professor in the Department of the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University, with joint appointments in East Asian Studies and in the history of science and technology. Lan is a historian of the body. Her new 2025 book maps, Improvising Meridians and Nerves in Global Chinese Medicine, which we'll be hearing from her today, offers a long history of invisible anatomy and a fascinating rethinking of how meridians and nerves were mapped across early modern and modern contexts. And in addition to this project, Lan also have published on the history of emotions, sensations, barefoot doctors, and the feminist intellectual history of Chinese medicine, which I believe is your second book project. And also she's working on her third project on the transnational history of numbness, or Ma in Chinese. And beyond all this, Lan is also a filmmaker and collaborating with medical practitioners in Shanghai, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, New York, Houston, and more. She also directs the Medicine, Race, Democracy Lab at Johns Hopkins, produces the Blue Barrel podcast that features scholars and activists in Asian study, Asian medicine, and leads many other creative projects. I really recommend checking her website and explore all the multimedia projects. It's best. And one last thing, before joining Hopkins, Lan has spent a couple years at Rice, so it's really exciting and fascinating to bring her back. So without further ado, let's please join me in welcome Dr. Lan Li.
Thank you so much. Tom has been an incredible organizer and host, and it's also amazing to see transnational Asian studies as a department, and also medical humanities is blooming and growing in all these ways. I was here for 3 years during COVID, which is really like 1,000 years, but it's such a pleasure to be back here at Rice. And this talk is based on the book that came out in 2025 this year. We're still in 2025. Also I wanted to thank Draha for making this possible, and Haven for all of the incredible logistics. It's been a treat to be back in Houston. And for those who are sitting in the back, part of this talk will be interactive, so I'll need volunteers at some point to do whatever this is. So my name is Lan Li. I'm a historian of the body, and one of the biggest questions that has animated a lot of my work is something quite simple. So a lot of what I do begins with a really simple question. Who here is interested in Chinese medicine or acupuncture? Oh, cool, okay. So I don't know you. So one question is, do you often hear the statement of whether or not Chinese medicine is scientific? Yeah, for you. Yeah, what's your name?
Oh, I'm Cindy.
Cindy.
Yeah.
Okay.
For me, like, in relativism, whether I don't know. Like, insurance doesn't cover it, and I think that's sort of much.
Insurance does cover some of acupuncture, but not always herbs. So the drug component is kind of tricky, and then insurance is it's a really big contentious issue. But if you were to answer this question of whether or not it's scientific, it seems like it's not as simple yes or no. It's an answer that involves a lot of institutions of, different stakeholders, different financial interests. And I was always interested in why Asian practitioners, either they were biomedical doctors or scientists, they were so ready to say no, it wasn't scientific. It seemed as if there was some kind of political motivation to say it's not a part of this modern society. And I had asked this question a lot as an undergrad, and it took me about 15 years to think around this question, think about the politics, think about the implications, and 15 years later, this book is now out, Body Maps, and I'm trying to also develop a language around and answer this question of, is it scientific? Because we also have to do a comparative critique of biomedicine. So this book is not about, it's not about clinical practice. A lot of my second project is more about clinical practice. This one is looking at invisible anatomy, and I'll say a little bit more about that. So body maps, I'm thinking about this, hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll see how these channels and images of invisible anatomy is a kind of technology or technique of life. And I'm thinking about technologies of life in this book as a long history of hand-drawn images for those of you who never maybe had acupuncture before, you might be familiar with these full body images of different lines on the body that you can either needle at or use to animate through herbs, but they're always drawn by hand. So it's a long history of hand-drawn images, which I describe as very old technologies that are representing invisible anatomy. That's a longer conversation. But these are technical images that had really practical implications on what the body could do and what it did do through units of life. So this whole thing, by the end of the talk, you'll see how this is a single unit of life. And in terms of how I'm defining technology, a lot of anthropologists, social scholars of social histories of technology turn to Marcel Mauss. If you don't know Marcel Mauss, he's often described as a sociologist, French sociologist, who has a collection of essays between the two world wars. And often he thinks about technology as a study of techniques. It's inherently an action. It has to be a kind of technique, and techniques are traditional, efficient acts. And for most, this has to be a social action. Any kind of technology has to be thought of as a technique because for him, between the two world wars, society is falling apart, and he thinks the only way to help humanity is to think about social actions. This can save humanity. It has to be a social action. Later on, other American scholars of technology, Lewis Mumford defines techniques as objects in practice of civilization and for civilization. So we start thinking about technology as supporting something related to modernity. Heidegger, who's also infamously a Nazi, is describing technology as human contrivances towards modernity, for modernity. So you start to see this pull away from technology as techniques of social action. And going back to Mauss, if we really think about this core concept of techniques as a kind of social action, there should be no division between the human and the technical, because inherently it's part of what we do and who we are. And yet, even though there should be no division between the human and the technical, and also Foucault, if you're into Foucault, he's writing about techniques of self, including biopolitics, sign and symbol, and also different actions we do to make our life better. But even in all this scholarship, somehow the human and the technical get separated. They get separated where the human dimensions are different, or they're divided from technical creations, and in part because, and I'm describing this among European theorists, is because they're writing about civilization. They're thinking about capital, they're thinking about labor, they're thinking about war, they're thinking about modernity, industry, and efficiency. There's something about the context of how scholars are writing and thinking about technology that consistently separates the human dimension from technical creations. So this kind of definition, even though we have most saying that you need to think about technology as techniques, this pull towards a history of technology as histories of efficiency, it doesn't apply to meridians. If I'm thinking about invisible anatomy, it doesn't apply to old East Asian objects. And I kept on wondering, what about histories of technology without efficiency? What if we didn't use this as a starting point? What if we used East Asian sources to theorize East Asian technologies or techniques? Where would our starting points be? Even though most and other scholars and theorists are really important. And so I thought of, I was talking to my parents, and this one story came up. If we used East Asian sources, there's a 5th century BC story it's from the Zhuangzi, if you know the reference, from the 10th volume of Tian Di, Heaven and Earth. And there's a story of this farmer. There's a scholar who's walking home, and he sees a farmer using a weng, this jar, to water plants. And he's watching this farmer struggle. He's slipping, and he's watering his crops. And the scholar tells him, I see you're having a hard time. Did you know that there is this device, there's a water pump, that could allow you to water hundreds of crops at the same time? And the farmer looks at him, and he starts to laugh. And he says, where there's a cunning device, there is a cunning action. Where there's cunning action, there is a cunning mind. And the Chinese 有机械, 只有机心. He says the cunning mind is not equipped for clarity. This lack of clarity agitates the spirit of life, and an agitated spirit of life cannot contain the dao. Maybe he's a different kind of, he's not really a farmer. He says, I know this device. Because in this part of China, very sophisticated irrigation systems, he knows about this water pump, he knows about this wooden device. He says, I know this device, and I'm ashamed to use it. So what does this mean? Sometimes some scholars would say, this is a Luddite, he's refusing technology, but I find this moment of refusal fascinating. What does this mean in the context of East Asia? Because just because you have these devices and technologies, you can still refuse to use it, and that's part of that history. Maybe it's the kind of technique he wants to cultivate. So is the moral of the story refusing a water pump? Is the moral to not be too clever, like put your iPhones away? I don't know. I'm not one to I need my devices because my mind is not cunning enough. But in terms of even when modernity starts, already in 2,500 years ago, people were refusing cunning devices. And other scholars, Alexander Woodside, has tried to shift the temporalities of when modernity starts. When are we modern? And so for someone like Woodside, he'll say that we should really be looking at, meritocracies and civil service exams. That's when modernity should start, and it pushes us back further from the 19th century. Other scholars like Dorothy Coe would say, well, you can't have an elite class without craftspeople. You can't have an elite class that's using calligraphy, that's using ink, without thinking about people making the ink stones. And so you have a parallel kind of track of not just looking at the elite class, but also at craftspeople and artisans. And of course, David Edgerton has famously put out this book called Shock of the Old that's looking at not big narratives of innovation, but at small technologies, everyday technologies, like chalk or blackboards, paper clips. And that affects our daily lives. And glasses, you think about, glasses are a really old technology that we use every day. So I was interested in the story not only because it's a refusal of cunningness, a refusal of cunning devices, but also because of the word that I've translated as cunning device. And here it's either jixi or gehai in Cantonese. Cunning could be clever, convenient, busy, active, mechanical, operational, disengaged, unfocused. It could be many of these different options, but this other character, device, could maybe also be technique. Maybe it's a technology or technique. And what's really fascinating about this word is I started thinking about how it's written. And most sinologists might also turn to etymology as one clue for thinking about deeper histories. This style of writing it shows you that this is an inherently material object. There's a wood radical, it's not gold, it's not bamboo. There's a kind of wooden device, it's a material object. And also, the way it's written, this style comes around the 7th and 10th century. It's a type of script called kaishu. Historically, when it's written in stone, there's an earlier version of a script style that looks closer to this. It's a stone script. It's a zhuanshu. And these characters, it just started to captivate my attention, especially this one. This word for technique or device is that if you take away the wood radical, you've got two hands reaching up to either a weapon or maybe something else, some kind of loom, some kind of device. But these hands, once you reconfigure them and you expand that part of the character, and this turns into also a hand, this becomes the word for self. So this word for self, what it offers us is that now we've moved away from any kinds of argument that technology is a movement for civilization because your self is already action. There's no separation between technique and technology. And the self is both relational and subjectified. And you can aspire to contain the Dao, you can avoid a cunning device. And so this allows us to think about a starting point where, for instance, the body and the self is a kind of technique. It requires technique, it's a kind of technology. And the reason why I say that is because for a lot of these practices, whether that's acupuncture, it's meditation, it's qigong, a lot of practitioners will tell you that this is the highest form of technology, the highest form of life science that we, whoever we are, have in East Asia. And that's something that we have to offer as kind of modern technique that's persisted for so long and adapted to different kinds of, different periods, different contexts. So how is this a kind of technology? And the way that I would define that is through a different starting point of thinking about the self as technology using East Asian sources. So here you might think technology as a study of techniques, techniques as a cultivation of self, and the self maybe as acts of moderation. And you'll see that later on when we talk about breath and moving meridians. And here, just from looking at maybe the words, the similarities between the characters for technique, device, and self, we might think of the self as something that doesn't separate the human domain from its technical creation. So again, in an East Asian context, it's already embedded within the word for self. Technique is a kind of action. So again, back to this question, how do we use East Asian sources? Let's go back a little bit. How do we use East Asian sources to theorize East Asian technologies and techniques? This question is also important because I'm not the first person to do this. We have Smith in the room who's written a lot about I Ching and divination, but a longer, really important body of work, if you're interested in histories of science and technology in East Asia, is this volume, Science and Civilization in China. It's a product out of the Second World War, and it's attributed to Joseph Needham, who's a chemist and embryologist, and Lu Guizhen, also a biochemist. And when they're writing this book, it's from this series where you get narratives like China, the first to invent gunpowder, to invent paper, a lot of these kinds of superlatives of what China has invented. And it's the series that's also answering this famous perennial question called the Needham question, which is, why didn't the scientific revolution happen in China? And a lot of scholars historians of science have been trying to respond to this question. The same question that I was asking you, why isn't Chinese medicine scientific or not? That's a legacy of this. It's a legacy of a project that actually perpetuates binary. Asia on one side, the East on one side, the West on the other, science on one side, tradition on the other. It's perpetuating binaries, and it's also perpetuating certain kinds of regimes of truth. What kinds of practices can enter modernity, can be defined by modernity, and also shape what we might think of as a modern society. So it's perpetuating regimes of truth. And yet, not all of the collaborators who have contributed to this huge series called Science and Civilization in China, not everyone buys into the Needham question. And so one scholar who's she's long retired, but Francesca Bray was a young scholar writing and contributing to a series on biotechnology and agriculture. And she's not a PhD student yet, but she's trained as an anthropologist, and she's reading people like Marcel Mauss. She's reading Mauss, and she's thinking about not necessarily big technologies, she's thinking about technique, she's thinking about people, relationships, space. And so she writes a really influential book called Technology and Gender, Fabrics of Power in Late Medieval China. She's thinking about space, where are women, where is the domestic space, what is technique and technology in this context? And weaving is really important. You might even see, I can say more about how this relates to weaving too, because the character for these paths are the same as the warp of a loom. I can say more about that later. But she's also contributed to one of the most influential volumes that has shaped my work, which is that it's not just about these big devices or small devices, but it's also about images. Images are also a sort of kind of technique and technology. And specifically, the kind of images that she deals with are these technical images that can either be made of text or demonstrate certain kinds of weaving methods or even images for divination, and it's called a tool. This word now, tool, is used really capaciously for any kind of image, but historically, this image is really important, this genre of image is important because it's a kind of template for action, and it's a technical image that is not an object of fine art. And you have a lot of fine forms of fine art paintings throughout East Asian history, but this is not that. And it's also not a lens, it's not a shot, it's not a photograph. So the reason why this kind of genre, this technical image, matters so much for me in thinking about meridians, for thinking about acupuncture, is because all of the images of invisible anatomy only exist in the genre of tool. They only exist in these line drawings. You can't visualize these paths through MRI scans, through CT scans, through fluorescent dyes. There is a scientist, a researcher in Beijing who's using AI to plot these paths, but you still can't see them all in full. It's only in these hand-drawn images, these old technologies.
And so when I write about invisible anatomy as body maps here, I'm thinking about the persistence of technical images that are articulating invisible anatomies. These are objects of self that are enacting different techniques of life. And you'll see more about what I mean by techniques of life. But this goes back to this question of how do we use East Asian sources to theorize East Asian technologies and techniques. And my answer is to look at the graphic genres. Where do these invisible anatomies live? A lot of work has kind of contributed to this project. I was trained in MIT in a history, anthropology, and STS program. So I read a lot about maps, I read a lot about lines, I read a lot about objectivity, and also there is a lot of work on histories of medicine and science in East Asia, and they do deal with acupuncture, which you might be familiar with if you have been in the clinic. This is some footage I've taken from a clinic out in Baltimore, needles under a red light lamp. This is footage from Sao Paulo of an acupuncturist, Nilza. So you have needles alongside smoke, alongside moxibustion, which your skin is supposed to absorb. And it's this kind of treatment. It's not just needling, but absorbing smoke that can treat many kinds of issues. So one example of moxibustion is that it can also treat, according to a 1950s textbook, nasal congestion, whooping cough, pleurisy, gallstones, bloody defecation, cholera, diabetes, insomnia. If you've got polyps or tonsillitis, you can find an acupuncturist, diphtheria, blood clotting, pediatric meningitis, facial nerve palsy. I think there's one more, no. But with all of this, what's so interesting is that you can activate these paths from externally with these external therapeutics, but also internally. You can activate these paths through the herbs that you take and from different kinds of body practices. So this book is not about acupuncture, again, it's about these images of invisible anatomy. And I'll just spend the rest of my talk today really dissecting the cover. They say don't judge a book by its cover, but I made the cover, so you can please feel free to judge it. So I'll just talk through the cover through its different layers, which come from different primary sources. So you'll notice that the book is about nerves and about meridians. So you've got nerves here, meridians on the other side. And the main argument is that you have physiologists who are expressing anatomy in these graphic genres, and they're debating what these invisible structures could do based on where they appear on the page. So they're all arguing about what's happening on the page. And then finally, mapping meridians and mapping nerves, or mapping meridians as nerves, they fundamentally underestimate the practical role of graphic forms. I mentioned it was a really important way to understand why these images don't match each other, why they don't overlap. It's because the images are living in a graphic form that doesn't translate. And I'm thinking about graphic genres, like literary genres, kind of in a really basic sense that they're enacting what Wittgenstein has called life forms, ideological stereotypes, generic types that are organizing social action. So something about the form of the image is invoking a response, right? And here you can think about life forms, either their nerves, their visible anatomy, their meridians. They invoke certain kinds of cosmologies. And here cosmology is not stars necessarily, it's about a whole context of relationships, of causal relationships. So how does this one pathway to another path? How does it allow you to know where to treat what? So it's a whole sequence of how things relate to each other. That's what I mean by cosmology. And they operate at different scales. So from the page to the human body, sometimes to the world around you, your environment. And the social action here, and this is really key to the subtitle of the book that my editor wanted to take out, but improvisation is a really important kind of social action because you need to know what to do. And I mentioned that these are all handmade illustrations. You have to draw by hand. So if you're an art student, you know that your hand can shake. It really depends on the kinds of medium you're using. So either on paper, wood block, or copper plates, you need abundant flourishes to invoke this complex cosmological objects. So again, handmade inscriptions is really important because then you start improvising. And I'll give you an example of what that means in the context of nerves. I won't talk about meridians, but I'll talk about nerves. How do you improvise images of nerves on paper? So this image comes from a 1951 textbook by Wang Xuetai Wansedai, who is a really young illustrator. He ends up being really important. You'll see he dies in 2008. In the early aughts, he was actually super important in standardizing acupuncture point names for the WHO. He's got a kind of complicated history, but when he's really young, he's making these pictures. He's an illustrator and a physician. So he makes these images of what he described as intercostal nerves, intervenes between costals, ribs. And if you read the Chinese, here it says that there are 11 pairs of intercostal nerves between the ribs. But what's interesting is that in the 1950s, intercostal nerves are not stable. They're not just 11 pairs. Sometimes they're 30 pairs, sometimes they're 12 pairs. And he's improvising here because there is a much longer history of intercostal nerves. One of the earliest images of intercostal nerves comes to us in 1663 by Thomas Willis, who is a British anatomist. And he is illustrating intercostal nerves as a set of branches, and he does a lot of dissections, but this image itself is not a product of dissection. He's imagining what intercostal nerves might look like, because for him and other early modernists in the 17th century, they're thinking about nerves in the body as a site for where passions live, where instincts live. It's all what's not in the rational mind is in your body. And again, he's not making this image through dissection, yet this image gets recopied and illustrated over and over again. And in 1678, Aimé Breton, who is a French anatomist, he makes the same image. He imitates Willis's image, and he adds a bunch of names to these invisible structures. Things that he's just, again, copied from someone else's imagination, because this is where, again, your passions should live. He's giving it names, like here's delta, here's some letters, you've got numbers on top, he has musical notations, you'll see forte, forte, forte in the middle. And so what does this tell us? So this tells us that when it comes to these illustrations of nerves, I'm not saying that nerves don't exist. I spent time in the touch lab, I was sectioning dorsal ganglia. I'm not saying that these are like all made up. I'm saying something about the images. There's something about the images that tells us what are the limits of what we can say about the body, because it's quite complicated. The whole ecology of cells in your body is really complicated. But these natural philosophers in the early modern period, in the 17th century, they're making non-empirical leaps to join nervous anatomy with nervous expression. Again, this is a really important statement. There is a separation between nervous anatomy and nervous expression. Because even now, if you talk to neurologists, they'll tell you in the behavioral setting that there's no neuroscience in neurology. There's something that's happening where the practice is far from what we're trying to do in the lab. So again, nervous anatomy, nervous expression, there's something that's dividing them. It's not empirical. And nervous anatomy, even though it's not empirical, comes to stand in as an empirical base for explaining all forms of human emotion, thought, and sensation, which is to say, how are you feeling? Are you high-strung? Are you low-key? Are you anxious? It's all your nerves. You're nervous. It's standing in for human emotion, thought, and sensation. And at the same time, even though nerves are coming to explain everything, they're still unstable, and they're unreliable as an object of modernity. They become a black box. They absorb explanations for everything. And they're also used to explain away meridians. They're used to explain away acupuncture. So as nerves emerge as an unstable but somewhat persistent, perennial way to collect all forms of human emotion and thought, not thought, but human emotions, it's trying to, a lot of physiologists in the 19th century are trying to use it to explain meridians, and yet they can't. And why is that? Why is it that in the last 2 centuries, physiologists continue over and over again to use nerves to explain away meridians and they fail? And so I respond by taking a close look at the images themselves. So this photograph that has a technical image inscribed on top is attributed to Lan Li, who is he's a medical reformer and educator in the 1930s. And he didn't grow up with acupuncture, but at one point he had really intense pain in his legs, sciatica in his legs. And his dad needled him with, used some needles and moxa and treated him for his sciatica. And he became so enamored with acupuncture moxa that he goes to Tokyo to study it. He's like, this is where it's at. And when he's in Tokyo, he starts to collect a ton of images. He sees all of these old, these full body images of invisible anatomy. and he starts to study them, he starts to replicate them. He's like, this doesn't exist in China. And he's copying images from the 14th century, images like this, images of meridian paths that move from the top of the body down to the base of the foot. You'll see that there's a shoe missing, and from the bottom of the foot up to the body. He knows that there are 14 individual meridians from the text that he's reading. Each one of them, he copies a full image. He compiles and translates the entire text. And he also replicates and is faithful to the bodies that they're described on, these Confucian scholarly bodies. And so here, I'm calling these images meridians because they're representing what are known as jingluo, jinglan, these channels in the body. This is a really broad kind of category of channels that are physically in the body because you also have sunluo, sunmai, you have other kinds of invisible anatomy that are not named. But when they're illustrated on paper, then I describe them as meridians. So here I'm thinking about it as a metaphorical term that's used to describe graphic representations of jingluo and jinglan. Again, I'm going back to the images as a point of analysis. This is where it gets kind of interesting. So these are graphic objects that are both relaying the materiality and the invisibility of corporeal structures that are shaping discussions of ontology and location. So again, it's both material and it's invisible. You can't see these. Some might say it depends on the kind of eye, the kind of vision you use. The flesh eye is the lowest form of seeing, and that maybe those who are using their mind's eye can see the full set of paths, but otherwise, they're inherently invisible. And meridians, now I'll get into a kind of a close reading. Really, this talk is a footnote in the book. It's basically on just things that I'm interested in right now, but meridians are representing elastic objects that are measured in flexible units of distance that animate, express, and compose life. So what does that mean, that these are elastic objects that are measured in flexible units? So the unit of measurement that we're looking at in this, in the context of meridians, they are part of a broad practice of just describing measurements on the body. So here, there's a body facing up and facing down, and it tells you the distance between different body parts. So here, on the face, you have the distance between the ears is 1 foot 3 inches, between the cheekbones is 7 inches, but on the arms, it tells you that people are different in size, so take measurements according to the body. Long and short inches, again, it's flexible, they vary from infants to the elderly. And what he describes as an inch is this unit called a twin. And you might notice, you might not notice, but I notice, what you might notice is that this hand in this position is a bodhisattva hand. It's actually a Buddhist mudra, and it's a fire mudra. In this context, no one seems to care, but what's interesting is that it's showing you that the inch, if you hold your hand this way, you can see the inside of your metatarsal. This is the same body inch. That is not super practical, but it's a kind of inch that historically could refer to either the size of a millet seed or the width of your mouth. But in these texts, it refers to the middle metatarsal. And what's so interesting about this twin is that it's part of a set of different flexible units, relative units. So one twin we might translate as an inch. It's not quite an inch, so I'm putting in quotations. 10 of these is 1 shoe. Maybe it's a foot, not quite a foot, but 10 of those is a zhang. Maybe it's a megameter. So here we have, let's see, 1 shoe, maybe an inch, 1 foot, maybe a megameter. It's like here is maybe a twin, and here is 1 shoe. And then here is a whole zhang. So it's really long, right? So it's like big megameter. The important thing is that these are all flexible. They're all flexible, and physiologists understood that. They knew that when they were making these images, that they were using units that were both relative and they're discrete, that they're specific units, right? And here, illustrators are reproducing early modern sources that are representing the body as a cartographic and cosmologically embedded object. So it's a map, but it's also full of relational things. And then this is where we get into a little bit of a deep dive into what these meridians are. This image is a 13th century image, and we'll get into what it means by both cartographic and cosmologic. It looks as if it's a topographical map, but it's associated with a 13th century scholar, Wang Haobu, who is not from a family of scholars, but he is really obsessed with classical texts. He's like reading a bunch of classical texts, and he gives himself the name Wang Hao, or lover of antiquity, because he loves the ancients. And he's reading all these early texts, and he's revisiting texts from the 1st century and trying to figure out what they're saying. So ignore the image, it's a complicated image. On the side, the text is pretty straightforward. It tells you that you have paths from the hands to the head to the feet. Oops, let's go back a little bit. Well, that's fine. So he'll tell you that there are paths from the hands to the head to the feet, and there's a correlation among heaven and earth. But then he goes on to tell you, or he goes on to repeat another earlier text that tells you that all of these paths have discrete measurements. Every single meridian in the body has a set length. So here we have meridians, and they're being measured as a twin, maybe an inch, shi, maybe a foot, and zhang, maybe it's a megameter. They're all measured in the units I just showed you. And we have yin paths, we have yang paths. You might not know that they're yin and yang pairs. They're qiao meridians, we can get into what that is later. My favorite set of meridians are yin mai and du mai, which move through the body like this. But they have discrete measurements. And I thought, when I read this, I was like, well, so how long are these? And I used my own twin to measure out meridians, which is where we have some interactive elements of the talk. So Tommy, if you can come up, and I'll need more volunteers in a minute. If you can actually, I don't know where's the best way to, maybe we can stand here. So I don't know, Lisa, if you want to move up a little bit. But Tommy, if you can hold this as high as you can. So my quest was to figure out how long are these really. Right? So we have 3 young hand meridians that are, I'll just use Chinese, 五尺三丈 total. So a 5尺 each, 三丈 total. So here are 3 hand meridians. Thank you. These are my hands, and you have to double them on either side. So 3 and 3. Lisa, if you want to come up this way, sure. And then there's the yin hand that is 35 寸 each, each total. So here's the yin. And if someone wants to come up, you're welcome to stand because you can sit for a while. Or which one's or this one? So we've got the yin, these are the hand meridians, these two. There's yang and yin here. And then we have the feet meridians, 3 yang feet meridians, 8尺 each, 4丈8尺 total. So that's left foot, right foot, the other side. And then we've got the yin feet, 6尺 5寸, each 3丈9尺 total. So here we have to do the other yin legs. And then the 2 qiao meridians here. Someone has to be right here. Someone. Yeah, that's okay. Cool. Oh, you want to just. And then my favorite, my 4尺 5寸 each 9尺 total. Okay, so here we have these meridians all mapped out. And these are my meridians. So for people who are holding it, you might notice that they're much, much longer than me. But for those who are holding the feet, the hands and the feet, the yin and the yang, what do you notice about the yin and the yang paths? What's the difference between them? This is yang. Right. Yeah, these are much longer. So yin is shorter than yang. Why? We'll get into that later. And then you'll see they're, again, much longer than my own body, but they're discrete measurements. They all have they're the same length. Doesn't matter where they're on the body, they're all the same length. Hold that right there. What's more important is that the text continues, and it tells you that not only are they discrete, but they actually all connect with each other. So these lengths all add up. I did see if there's some math involved. So these lengths all add up. Let's go right here. I don't want this. Okay, so this is like a little circle. So these lengths, they all add up. I feel like I'm on HGTV. I prepared this. It's like they all add up. You can see that the yin and yang pads, yin and yang feet, and there's a qiao mai. These all add up to a single unit. They all add up to 16,220 1,620. This number, 1620, super important, just remember it. 1620 twin. And 2 steps result in 50 cycles, 13,500 breaths, make a living person based on images of water clocks. So what this means is that these units of distance are also units of time. You'll see water clocks, they're units of time. And units of time are also units of life because you're breathing. 13,500 breaths make a living person. So again, units of distance are units of time are also units of life. This number is also important, 13,500, because there's another text from the Li that describes when you inhale and exhale, you're moving the qi 3 twin. Inhale moves the qi, another 3 twin. Qi travels 6 twin. So every time you inhale, exhale, you're moving and you're making the mind every time you breathe. And you wonder why I mentioned it's not just acupuncture that can animate these paths, it's also your breath. Because you're making it as you're breathing. And if you ever wonder if you go to an acupuncture clinic why you have to stay on the table for so long, it's because they're waiting for the qi to move along these paths in a full cycle. Every time you inhale and exhale, it's always moving. So units of breath are also these units of life. This number, 13,500, I was just doing some math, so this number makes sense because you notice you move every 3 twin, 620. So 621 inhale, 1 exhale, 16,120 twin divided by 6 twin is 270 breaths. 270 breaths, 1050 cycles is 13,500 breaths. So these numbers are not arbitrary. They're all part of the same system. This is my math, but there are papers that have been published on this before I did this math, but whatever. So water clocks, I thought this was an interesting reference because this is an 18th century image of water clocks. But you'll see at the bottom of the 4th water clock, there's a ruler in that tub that is actually a ruler divided into 100 units. And each unit is a step or a ke. 100 units, a day is divided into 100 units, which is around 15 minutes. So I mentioned that when you're on the acupuncture table, you have to sit there for 30 minutes because one breath, one full cycle is around 30 minutes per breath, if we want to use a rough translation of what it looks like now. So you can put this down if you want. We're going to stay here. I think it's quite pretty. But you can put this down. Do you want to put this down? Okay, we can put this down. Okay. Well, we can leave it here. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I can also... So later on, different people have different kinds of interpretations. Wang Hao says that maybe our bodies are slowing down and you need to breathe for longer. Maybe you need an hour per breath because in his time period, there's a lot more epidemics. Like, there are dozens of epidemics in the 12th century, and he's freaking out because he's like, you don't have a way to treat these people. And all the physicians, he calls them brainless zombies. Translation. He calls them brainless zombies because they don't actually know how to help in the context of an epidemic. But in any way, he's like, our bodies are struggling. This is his interpretation of time. But in any case, when you look at an image like this, a close reading of these tools, they show you specific kinds of accuracy that are featuring, again, discrete lengths made of flexible units that are tethered to fixed quantities of time. 100 units a day, 2 cycles to have a full breath. And which is to say that these quantities of distance and breath, they may also have had neurological purpose, meaning, and implication. I told you that this number of 1,600, oh my gosh, I can't do it. 1,620 of the total meridian paths. This is important. This number is also important, 13,500 breaths, because if you add up the numbers individually, they add up to 9, which is the word for longevity. And if you look at any of these early acupuncture texts, even now, they'll tell you that there are 360 ancient or persistent traditional points. 3 plus 6 is 9. There's always this kind of numerological consistency. And the way you pronounce 9 is similar to longevity, to control, and to live forever. So there's some kind of numerological consistency here. But this is to say that meridian tool as technological objects, they're measuring other objects. They're measuring objects in the body, these jingluo and jingmai, that are moving life, and they also make life if you knew how. You could sustain your life if you knew how to move them by making them in these long breaths. So there's a lot more going on with just saying that these are nerves. Right? There's something else going on. They have discrete lengths, and you can animate them and create them. each time you live. So this image, this final image, meridians, it again comes to us from Wang Xuetai. And he starts to imagine that meridians are not nerves. He's not drawing them in the same, coloring them in the same color. He makes meridians red in a new edition of the textbook that's published 3 years later. And he's also thinking about how, he's reading these same texts, he's thinking about how these meridians are, again, a single unit. They move in a circle. They move through your hands and feet. They connect at the hands and feet. The yin and yang connect at the hands and feet. And they're moving through the torso. They're moving through all of your organs. And they're also, again, correlated to units of distance. They're also units of life. They're the single unit. And he becomes obsessed with this. So this is an image that he makes in the 1960s that has yin and yang correspondences. And this is the original source. He's thinking about this as a single unit. And even as he ages, later on, he dies, again, I mentioned in 2008, but later in his life, when he is trying to standardize acupuncture points for the WHO, he also edits a text called the Illustrated Manual of Chinese Acupuncture Moxibustion, and in it he invites someone to write about time, to write about calendars, to write about different phases, to write about Taoist trigrams, which are really fundamental to the numerology. And he's looking at all of this. He's looking at all of these different units of time, and he also adds a new image of his single meridian wheel. He's saying, again, this all creates a foundation for understanding how this is a single unit of life. So just going back to the book to wrap up, to understand this discursive, political, and the ontological states of body maps, of invisible anatomy, it really requires many methodological approaches, maybe some counting, some math, art history, reconstruction, doing this. Somehow this took I've also tried to trace and draw these images. It took hours and hours just to get the dimensions right. But it uses different methodological approaches to wrestle with these invisible structures as dynamic technical objects, because they are moving, right? And so interrogating meridians and nerves through graphic genres, through the genre of a tool, also demonstrates why and how they have failed to meet. Because you can't say that this single unit is only moving and making life through nerves. There's a lot more that's happening. There's a lot more in this cosmology, this whole orientation, this network of different kinds of numbers and structures and measurements of time and distance. So that's where this book kind of starts. It covers 10 centuries, but essentially it's also setting up a second project that I mentioned. I don't work on clinical cases in the first project, but the second one is a film series and a history of feminist material histories of modern Asian medicine through looking at practice, through looking at different objects that are telling time, that are telling units of life, or making units of life. And it's also looking at different kinds of tools. Oh, I actually brought one. I brought one of these compasses. There are these compasses. I thought this was really interesting because in the 70s, there is in the 70s, there is a physician in China. See, it's right here. I was going to buy more this way, but he was right here. So this is a kind of mini calendar that you can put in your pocket. And this woman who trained in the 1970s moved from China to Paris, and she has since created this research unit for understanding acupuncture points in time. And she uses this to understand and treat people with either with COVID or with side effects from vaccines. And she uses this to understand which points to kneel at which times of day, depending on who you are and what kind of side effect you have. So it's a really complicated calculation. I have to also just look at it really closely. But this is, again, part of a practice that gives me a way to answer a really basic question, develop language around a basic question. What does it mean for something to be scientific? What does it mean for something to be empirical? And why do we ask these questions in the first place? And how do we develop language around it? And how do we, again, use East Asian sources to theorize East Asian technologies and techniques? So that is an ongoing pursuit in this book that is freely available, open access, and thanks very much.
would love to know how you came to all this.
How?
Yeah.
It began when I was a very small child. So something that always interested me, I think it started with music. So my parents are musicians. My dad's a music theorist, my mom's a performer. They work on they graduated from a Chinese conservatory. And I think that entire world has shaped how I approach science. I started out as a biology major, and because I was, told to avoid anything related to art. And when I took science classes, no one was teaching history of science in Asia, let alone question related to medicine. There are very few of us. And then when I started history of science, when I started taking classes in history of science, I was wondering why musical instruments weren't part of any kind of understanding of cosmology. If you look at a wuqin, you see that there is very kind of fairly precise indications of harmonics, and I had no one to talk to. And so I think that this is a whole effort to find people to talk to. So I found Tom as a Dr. Gerber, people in the room are people to talk to. But I think that quest of both engaging with this as an aesthetic project and as an intellectual project moves everything that I do. The films that I make, the presentations that you see, and I create symmetry because I want people to talk. I want to figure out how to talk. And that in itself is it's another enterprise of social action. It's another attempt to, I want to say bridge, but that's a bit naive because people can refuse. So it is an art project, but we know that art transforms how we move in the world. So I would say that what the source of all this is through music, because I also think about, there was also the yin, like 5 musical modes that connect to the 5 colors, that connect to the 5 phases, wood, fire, air, water, metal. And it also connects to organs, the 5 different essential organs. So there's a cosmology that is deeply, deeply built that very few scholars in English write about. So that's...
It's a wonderful talk, very stimulating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think we're all overwhelmed.
Oh, really? Oh, really? Oh my gosh.
No,
Thank you.
magnificent.
Thank you. Yeah, Tom.
That's good. This is wonderful. Thank you so much for this great talk. You showed a picture with meridians look like cartography, like a map.
Yeah.
Would you mind explaining that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a hard image to work through because this is a really hard image to work through because it has, well, let me start with where this image comes from. It's a Japanese copy of a wood block. So it's hand copied of a wood block, which means that I don't know when it's dated. The original text is dated to around 1234, but I don't know when this copy is made. And there are also different kinds of inconsistencies, we might call them errors, in this image itself. On the top of the image, you can see there's like 2 eyes at the top. For those who read Chinese, you'll see the 2 eyes at the top. I'll just point them out over here. There are 2 eyes here. Here's eyes. There's also ears here, ears over here. Sometimes these 2 characters appear as sun and moon in other versions of this wood block. And there's also Taoist trigrams here. You'll see these these trigrams. I mentioned yin and yang. So when the line is broken and when it's solid, they're representing yin and yang. A broken line, I think, is yin. A solid line is yang. So here is 3 yin lines. Here is 3 yin lines. Here is yang, yang, yin. So the trigrams are also associated with different characters. And sometimes the line breaks are inconsistent. Sometimes they're also wrong in this version. So it tells us more about who's making it. And a close reading of this, here are 2 feet. I wonder if I can use, oh my God, I have laser. So feet here, 足. So it's corporeal, but there is a lot of really interesting inscriptions and also here's Shunqi. There's also a lot that's happening. This is an incredibly active, some might even say chaotic image. but it's all relational. There has to be some kind of order to this because you have a sense of top and bottom, and you have a sense of flow. But it's not a typical image at all. So it should be easy to hear on what point of view did this image, and I wrestled with it, but the closest I've gotten is to making this. So, so that's as much as I can tell you about just reading this image, because the text around it is much more easier to make sense of. It's very basic, the text on the flanking either side. And the central image itself is just, it's a really, it invites a lot more study. So if someone else wants to look at this, I have different versions of the image. I'm choosing this because it's the clearest copy. It's the clearest digital copy.
So some of the meridians are mapped on a human body shape.
Yes. Sometimes they're not. Yeah. Same thing with the circle. With this here, with a single unit, sometimes it's not on a human form. And I find that also really interesting because meridians can jump the corporeal body. Okay, this is going to get into, sorry, I can get into kind of weird science if you want.
You haven't been there already.
Yeah. Oh, so thank you so much for your talk. I thought it was fascinating. I have didn't that past exposure to acupuncture, but now I know a bit more of it. You mentioned past philosophers, physicians have difficulties reconciling the problem of bodies struggling with walking the cycle that is the what was it again? What was the weight that you had on that chair?
This one, here,
Yes,
the loops.
exactly.
Yeah. And then he's like, our bodies are slow, we're kind of struggling. This one.
Yeah. That was modern era now. How do you reconcile this difficulty with how our bodies are function properly?
So one big question is, who has trouble sleeping? Do they have trouble sleeping? Oh my God, no one else has trouble sleeping?
Okay.
Oh, okay, no, you started to say, I mean, oh my gosh, all the hands. In terms of, if you think about, there's a lot of anxiety. We tend to have, so much of discussions of mental distress and productivity is around the need to squeeze as much action as possible. It's not about human relationships, it's about the human engine. And we can connect this to histories of industry, histories of labor, of course. I was talking to Chang about this in that often the modern period is about speed. Here, what if we counterbalance that with slowness? And I would say, 100% our bodies are changing a lot. And acupuncturists also modify their practice to this changing body. And what's fascinating about what I described here is that in practice, with many schools of practice, many schools of thought, and they might not always agree with each other. That's what makes medicine interesting, is that the body is just a cadre-created object, meaning that it's composed of conjugate components. In the same way that a single system might conjugate another system. And I'm not saying that East and West are incompatible with each other, but within itself, there's a whole kind of universe of possibility, where if one kind of treatment doesn't work for you, you go to another one. You can always have choices among different practitioners. When I was in Houston, some practitioners will only take a biomedical diagnosis and only treat you based on that diagnosis. Other practitioners might take your pulse, they might read your whole body, they might say, oh, well, you have, if you're describing it this week, you have trouble digesting, maybe you had a breakup recently, they'll needle different parts. They'll look at your body differently. They might not tell you that you have to breathe more slowly, but they're always calibrating to how you are at that moment. And again, lots of different practices and lots of different kind of contradictory approaches, but you have to see what works for you. And there's always that, we can say improvisation, the kind of improvisation that's happening in the clinic. So even with something like this in the 13th century, people are also aware that practices are super diverse, even if you have really consistent neurology. So in the next project, I'll be writing more about clinical practice because it is complicated. Once you get into the real world, oh my God, it gets messy. So I needed to write this book in order to understand what was happening in theory before I entered the whole big crazy world of all the things that don't make sense. So, yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. In the beginning, the 2 minutes talk was
Oh, can you say?
incredible. looking at
Mm-hmm.
words,
Mm-hmm.
the hands.
Yes, yes.
And about 2-3 years ago, sorry, is this on Zoom? You know who's
Oh yeah, it's on Zoom. Oh, is someone?
who else is watching?
I think. Oh, should I?
Is anyone who's curious?
Yeah. Is there? So let me see. I don't know, but this doesn't. Yeah. Do you know who else is on Zoom? Or is there a way to mute? Do you want to mute for a minute?
No, I'm just curious. I don't. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
There's a scholar, Paul Golden, who was arguing that to read Chinese philosophy or so yeah, within how the characters are actually written is a misreading. And I was like thinking about that I was taught my very elementary Chinese was to the way the hand you saw reflects that, right? And you do that. You look at the hands and the tools and that. So I was wondering, is there a bigger debate about how to read philosophy or culture within the characters? I'm assuming you're not on his side of this debate. I was wondering why you also then use that method to understand technology.
Yeah. No, this is 100%. This is kind of a key. It's definitely a key debate, and this connects to another project on numbness, which is looking at the character for numbness. It's often translated as numbness, but it's actually a botanical character. It's the same word for sesame, flax, hemp. But yeah, there are definitely issues with just focusing on the character itself. What you mentioned is that, yes, logocentrism has led to very narrow understandings of what becomes Orientalism. There's also this huge war in sinology versus area studies, looking at the social and political context. Yes, language changes. Yes, the logogram sometimes there's similar characters for very different meanings. And yes, again, language, grammar, all these writing systems change over time. But what's interesting about individual, if I'm looking at, for instance, it's context by context. So I do use this as a method, but I'm also using it alongside material reconstruction. I'm using it alongside literature, poetry analysis. I'm looking at the images as well. So I'm not using it as a single starting point because it does have to be quite capacious. What's interesting is that there is definitely a kind of a trapdoor under looking at a single word. And in the case of my work on numbness, which is only one character, there are problems of a false borrowing, of fake borrowing, where the same word pronounced the same way. It could be used in all different contexts. There's also paronomastic, the same word for phonetically similar words. We have it in English too, whether or mother. There's also parasemantic, the same graph used to write a second word where the meaning is already in the graph. Exogenous plants, exogenous viruses. So yeah, for anyone interested in linguistics or in writing systems, using this alone, 100%, it could be, if you're not aware of the pitfalls, you could be deeply wrong, and you could be super misguided, and it could just fall into this language, create civilization, and the whole civilization can be only understood through its words. That is true. So one of the reasons why, even when I look at numbness, I also do reconstruction. I look at recipe books, and I make the recipes. So there always has to be an embodied component. And so what the method that you described, it's a big methodological question. And I think for a lot of scholars, you need to be interdisciplinary in your approach. So yeah, I think it's a huge debate and one that is very well taken. Yeah, thank you. Thinking of weird science, but we don't need to do that. No. Are you not into weird science? Okay. Oh, but yeah,
this is half formulated question, but regarding your Chuangzi, which is such a beautiful reference. I work a lot with Peter has this idea of tactical retreat, which is very similar to this.
Oh yes, hermit life.
Yeah, but also taking a technology and rejecting it. And he speaks specifically about the Maori people in the mound builders in the Midwest. And so I'm really interested in this idea of like, on the one hand, it's like, it is like a technology. It's like, you know, I would be ashamed of using that device. But on the other hand, the only technology that can encompass these, you know, catalog these meridians is hand drawing. And then so this paradox I find very interesting. And I wondered if you, I guess, have any more to say about the different points in history where these choices had to have been made along the course of this.
When is someone like that? It seems like your question is also about temporality. We were having this conversation at lunch with Erica Tintin about fast and slow. Usually, when you compete for the best therapeutic treatment, you want the one that's fast. Like here, I can show you instantly that you were cured. It's like it's a little bit of it's a race to whatever you want. I mean, it's an arbitrary marker, but it's a race to being better. And what's interesting about fast and slow, retreating or not retreating, engaging with different techniques, is that in the 20th century at least, there's an argument that acupuncture works faster than antibiotics, for instance. It works faster than anesthesia. It's more accurate than anesthesia. This is a conversation that happens a lot with acupuncture analgesia, where you use needling to induce local analgesia where you can't feel pain, but you can feel light touch, and that's induced within 20 minutes. You can cut into the body when the person is awake, completely awake. They feel the light touch. They hear their ribs being sawed as they're draining fluids from the lungs, and they're not bothered by it because they're not under anesthesia. The blood pressure isn't dropping; it's stable the whole time. And just using needles to induce local analgesia allows this. I mean, there's a whole discourse of it's effective and it's fast, and you can do it in emergency rooms in the context of an emergency. You can do it on animals without to counteract this idea that's just a placebo. And so there's this idea of speed. We're cultivating a body like this, or using practices like this, even if it's part of a, even if I want to say there's a larger context of refusal. In the clinic, speed matters. And so you see this also as a technology of speed, saying that, I was at this acupuncture conference here in Houston. There's a kind of healing method called the balance method, where the meridian paths that are in pairs are like a homunculus. You needle one and its sister path, that point that needs to be treated, instantly is like relieved. So for like muscle pain or like clenched jaws, like that's part of a path that you can needle in its mirror and it's instantly gone. And so that kind of discourse of efficacy and evidence is through speed. And whether I want to retreat to the hermit life, I think that's a bigger question of choice and what's possible. But I think what I'm taking your question is in the context of temporality, of slow and fast, of retreating versus engaging. And I think it's a really complicated social question too. Yeah.
Thank you for this. It was fascinating. I have a lot of questions, but one is, so you're talking about this project as being about the ways that people have theorized these meridians, right? And you described the next one as more kind of rooted in the clinic. So what is the relation between those realms? Like, are there theorists who are creating this kind of stuff who are also clinicians, or do they often work closely with a particular clinician, or how does that work?
Such an important question. So this this kind of set of theories I was just in China, and I gave a version of this talk. It was like a mix of Chinese and English. I gave a version of this talk to acupuncturists in Taiwan. I also gave this talk to acupuncturists in Houston. So Phil and Melissa have seen a version of this talk. Thanks for coming in. And my response from clinicians, the ones in Houston, they came to me after the talk and they're like, this makes so much sense because no one explained this to us. We were learning the practice and we couldn't understand how these different paths related to each other. And in part that might be a failure of pedagogy, that might be a demonstration of how standardization almost becomes a rigid template where it doesn't allow for exploration or making connections. And so even one acupuncturist was like, this made me, I was really frustrated with my training, and when I saw your talk, I felt a release. Like, I felt like my practice, when it made sense to me, it allowed more flow in my intellect and what I was doing in the clinic. So there were a range of practitioners, people who graduated years ago, people who were still in training. And in China, a lot of scholars, when they came up to me, they were like, we've never seen methods like this before because all of our methods are text-based. And then I had on WeChat, this one scholar was like, this phrase of 50 cycles, there are a lot of articles about this ancient text. And 50 cycles is all part of a Taoist trigram, you might call it Taoist, but it's a trigram of calendar cycles. It undergirds so many other neurological things because one question that came up among the acupuncturists, they were like, well, why is it 1,620 twin? Like, where does that number come from? And nobody could answer except for the philologists. So there was this kind of bridge that was happening. Like there's an entire philology we weren't talking about, even for those acupuncturists. So I see that connection happening. In terms of the second project, I think that gets into, well, again, John and I were talking about this. It gets into another interest I have in inner alchemy and the cultural elements of both on film, in operas, in personal diaries and music. How do these practices that promise so much, promises to treat you of cholera, pediatric meningitis, it promises to bring you into a uniquely Chinese, modern world. It promises a lot. How does that fit into an entire constellation of other kinds of cultural objects that mimic the same kind of hope? So I'm thinking about the clinical practice as part of technologies of hope, of future making. So that I'm also bringing in music into the second project. I mentioned opera, popular films, and I'm embedding this into that bigger discourse. And it has to, and it's not just looking at China, it's also looking at the diaspora. And it's inspired by my time in Houston because the book actually ends with my first acupuncturist who's Haitian. So she's a doctor of Chinese medicine, but uses Chinese medicine as a way for her to practice Vodou, as a way to also include her calling on ancestors when she's massaging someone or when she's practicing acupuncture. Some shamans will tell you that every time you put a needle into a point, you're exercising something there. So it gets into a lot of what we might call religion and magic, but there's a reason why those practices persist alongside acupuncture, because they've always been part of it, and they're part of a bigger constellation of technologies of hope. I want something to work. Why does this not work? Maybe this other thing works. So whether or not it's religion, magic, or medicine, they're all kind of in this, they're all part of this kind of persistent cosmology that has a much longer history. So I think I'm seeing that connection when I jump across theory into practice. It'll be fun. It's going to be a series, and I'll show you when I start editing. So I was going to start filming in January, so we'll see how that goes. We'll see if it's going to be. I'll tell you more about it. Yeah.
I was wondering about the relationship between what's relative and what's standardized in these practices. Because I feel like a lot of the importance of medical humanities here is to counterbalance the extreme vision of the standard body, the standard patient, standard treatment. Here, there seems to be a lot of emphasis on what's relative, as well as some standardization. And I was wondering if you talk about binaries, if they are kind of binary concepts, or if that tension doesn't exist so much.
This is, it's a huge question. When the WHO group was trying to standardize acupuncture points, they were fighting. There was a lot of fighting. You had acupuncturists representing China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and they were fighting because they have different names for different points. And at one point, actually, the acupuncturist from Korea was trying to mediate China and Japan. China pulled out, Japan pulled out, then they couldn't present anything to the WHO. They spent years on this. This one acupuncturist flew to Tokyo and flew to Beijing being like, you guys have to be friends, just give up 2 points. Everybody just give up your 2 points. And then we can have consensus. So it's a huge debate. Even standardizing the names is a huge debate because sometimes you have one point with multiple names or the same name for multiple points. Sometimes the points on the page would move. And so that has been, I mean, it's one of the people involved in who saw that whole process unfold, James Flowers. He quit being an acupuncturist and became a historian because he was like, this is weird, and I have no way of making sense of this. So you have scholars coming out of, again, like we kind of are these, I don't say that we're rejects, but we kind of, exile ourselves from the politics to make sense of the politics. So standardization in the last 30 years is extremely contentious, and it might remain contentious because there is an attempt to use standardization for a language of certainty. And that language of certainty is one that in the medical humanities we're trying to at least give students a way to manage because the world isn't like that. We know the world isn't like that. And as I've been talking to more experienced acupuncturists, they'll tell you that so much of their practice is about understanding uncertainty. When they go into a clinic, they will never come in with preconceived notions or any assumption about who they're meeting, how they are that day. And they see a lot of early acupuncturists being very certain, oh, it's going to be this point, it's going to be that, and that gets them in trouble. But the more experience you have, the more you're able to be very skilled at improvising. And I think that's where a lot of performance theory enters this analysis because you cannot improvise if you're not a master of that craft or master of that genre. If you don't know yourself or you know what's in the room, you can't just like bullshit. So, which is, again, skill and mastery is it's required in order to understand certainty. And I think that's something that more and more I see. So it's not about standardization, it is a political endeavor. Or a force.
I think there may be some questions.
Oh yeah, okay. I don't know how to find what should I? Okay.
How do I? Should I? Okay. Oh, chat in the chat. Okay. Oh, there's a Q&A feature. Okay. No. Okay. 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 Cool. All good.
Actually, it's close to the end.
Okay.
So do we have one last question? No? If not, please join me in giving Lan another round of applause.